The president of our homeowners association stood at the end of my driveway, laughing so hard at the flood barrier I had built that his wife had to touch his arm and tell him to breathe. He called it ugly, paranoid, and embarrassing to the neighborhood. And less than half an hour later, I watched muddy stormwater blow through the front doors of his glass front mansion while he screamed at a contractor on speakerphone like the man could argue with gravity. Now, I know that sounds like the kind of thing a bitter old man would make up after one too many cups of gas station coffee, but I promise you, every word of it happened, and the worst part is, none of it had to happen at all. My name is Raymond Cole. I am 71 years old, retired utilities supervisor, former municipal drainage inspector, and for most of my life I believe there were two kinds of people in this world: folks who fix problems and folks who dress problems up with nice landscaping and hope nobody notices the smell. I spent 43 years crawling through pump stations, culverts, water mains, and sewer tunnels from Oklahoma down through central Texas. So when I tell you water has a memory, I'm not trying to sound poetic. I mean it the way a mechanic means an engine has a sound. Water remembers where it is supposed to go, and when somebody forces it somewhere else, sooner or later it tells on them. My wife, Marianne, and I moved into Ashford Lakes after her diagnosis. Mild cognitive decline. That is what the neurologist called it. Soft voice, clean office, little framed diploma behind him. Like using gentle words could keep your whole life from cracking open. We had lived in the same 2-story brick house for 32 years, raised 2 daughters there, buried 3 dogs in the backyard, survived layoffs, surgeries, 1 tornado warning that had us eating peanut butter crackers in the bathtub at midnight. But the stairs had started confusing Marianne, and some mornings she would stand in the hallway holding a coffee mug with both hands, looking at the second floor like it had moved there overnight. So we solved the place, packed what mattered, donated what did not, and bought a smaller 1-story home in Ashford Lakes, a planned community outside Waco where the lawns looked like they had been combed, the ponds had little stone bridges, and every mailbox matched, like somebody was afraid individuality might lower property values. At first, I thought it would be peaceful, and maybe that was my first mistake, because peaceful neighborhoods do not usually need that many rules. Ashford Lakes was run by a man named Grant Emery, president of the HOA, real estate broker, developer's nephew, owner of the kind of white teeth you only see on billboards and men who apologize by hiring lawyers. His wife, Celeste, treated the neighborhood like a private resort she was managing for invisible guests, always talking about curb appeal, lifestyle consistency, and community standards, which mostly meant she did not like anything that reminded her real people lived behind those front doors. Then there was Dr. Preston Bale, HOA treasurer, spine surgeon, Creekside homeowner, and the only man I have ever met who could make checking his watch look like an insult. Those 3 lived up on the North Ridge, where the houses sat above the old drainage basin, or big windows and outdoor kitchens and imported stone patios, and somehow, no matter how hard it rained, their driveway stayed dry as a church bulletin. Our section sat lower, not poor by any means, but lower, older couples, retired teachers, nurses, a postal worker named Hank who grilled chicken every Sunday whether it rained or not, people who mowed their own yards and worried about insurance deductibles. I noticed the first odd thing during one of my morning walks with Marianne. She liked to walk early because the light was soft and the neighborhood was quiet enough that she did not feel crowded by the world. We were passing the little decorative creek behind Fairmont Court when I saw fresh concrete along a culvert that was supposed to be original construction. Too smooth, too clean, wrong color by about 10 years. Then I noticed the slope of the water channel had been shaved down near the ridge side, and a line of ornamental boulders was hiding what looked like a bypass cut behind the landscaping. Most people would have seen expensive yard work, maybe even admired it, but I had spent too long around drainage systems to believe rocks get placed that carefully for beauty. Over the next few weeks, I started paying attention, not snooping, just noticing, which is what old men do when our knees hurt too much to jog, and our brains still need a job. After every rain, water pooled in strange places, never where the original grading would have sent it, and the more I watched, the more I realized the runoff was being steered away from the North Ridge and pushed down toward our middle lots, like somebody had taken the whole neighborhood and quietly tilted the rules. I tried to bring it up once at an HOA open forum, just politely. Nothing dramatic, I said I had concerns about drainage modifications near the creek basin, and Grant smiled at me the way a bank manager smiles before denying a loan. He said, "Ray, we appreciate your experience, but Ashford Lakes was engineered by professionals, and sometimes retirees see problems where there are just maintenance upgrades." A few people chuckled, not cruelly maybe, but enough. Marianne squeezed my hand under the folding chair, and I let it go. Because when your wife is losing pieces of herself, you learn not every fight is worth dragging home. Then came the storm that changed everything. It was not a hurricane, not one of those disasters that makes national news. Just a slow, mean Texas storm that popped itself over us on a Thursday night and dumped rain like it had a personal grudge. Around 2 in the morning, Marianne woke me by touching my shoulder, not shaking me, just touching me with these cold fingers, and when I opened my eyes, she was standing beside the bed in her nightgown whispering, "Ray, the kitchen is outside." I did not understand it first. Then I heard it, that soft, ugly lapping sound no homeowner ever wants to hear indoors. Water was sliding under the back door, thin at first, then thicker, brown with mulch and grit, creeping across the tile toward the breakfast table where Marianne kept her pill organizer and a little ceramic rooster she bought in Santa Fe. I got towels, then more towels, then the shop vac, which was about as useful as trying to drink a lake through a straw. Marianne stood near the hallway, trembling, asking if we needed to call her father, who'd been dead since 1988, and that hurt worse than the water, worse than the ruined cabinets, worse than the family photo boxes in the closet soaking through before sunrise. By morning, our garage smelled like mud and gasoline. The bottom drawers in the kitchen had swollen shut, and Marianne sat wrapped in a blanket at the table, staring at the dirty waterline on the wall like she was trying to remember whether she had done something wrong. I walked outside exhausted, soaked, the quid, angry in that hollow way that makes your hands feel steady, and I looked up the hill toward Grant Ellery's house. His driveway was dry, not damp, not barely wet, dry, with 2 landscapers already blowing a few leaves off the stone pavers while my wife sat inside afraid of her own kitchen. That was the moment something in me changed, not snapped. Snapping is too loud. This was quieter than that, colder, like a lock turning. I could live with rich people being ridiculous. I could live with HOA notices about trash cans being visible from the street for 12 extra minutes. I could even live with Celeste sending a neighborhood email about approved seasonal wreath dimensions, but I could not live with somebody engineering water onto families like mine so their own patio stayed pretty. So I'd built the barrier. Not a bunker, not some doomsday wall, a proper flood defense, low-stacked limestone, reinforced footing, hidden weep channels, a rear drainage trench tied into the legal side easement, and flower beds along the front, because Marianne loved yellow lantanas, and I figured if I was going to start a war with rich people, I might as well make it cheerful. It cost me nearly $11,000, which was more than I wanted to admit and less than another flood would have cost us. And it took me 24 days because my back is not the same back I had at 40. When it was done, it looked good, better than half the so-called luxury landscaping in Ashford Lakes, and for the first time since the flood, Marianne walked outside, touched the stone with her fingertips, and said, "This feels safe." That should have been the end of it. Of course, it was not. The first letter came 3 days later, concern regarding unauthorized exterior structural alteration. The second came certified mail, violation of visual harmony guidelines. The third came in person. Because men like Grant Ellery do not just want compliance, they want witnesses. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a black Mercedes SUV with Celeste beside him and Dr. Varley stepping out behind them. All 3 dressed like they had wandered away from a fundraiser for people who hate soup kitchens. Grant stood at the curb, hands on his hips, smiling at my wall. "Well, Ray," he said, "I have to admit, I did not know we were preparing for a medieval siege." Celeste laughed through her nose and said, "It does feel a little hostile, doesn't it?" I wiped mortar dust off my hands and said, "Floodwater is hostile." Celeste, limestone just sits there. Dr. Vale tapped the stone with his shoe, like he was inspecting a body. "You understand this makes the neighborhood look unstable," he said. I looked at him and said, "Doc, if a 2-foot wall makes your neighborhood look unstable, Ed was already unstable." Grant's smile thinned. "You did not get HOA approval. I got county approval. That is not the same thing." It is the one that matters when water enters my house. Behind me, Marianne had come onto the porch, holding the rail, confused by the voices, and I saw her face tighten the way it did when too much noise came at her too fast. Grant saw her too, and still he kept going. Dirty days, Ray. Remove it voluntarily or the board escalates. Then he leaned closer, lowered his voice just enough to make it personal, and said, You may have worked around pipes all your life, but this community runs on rules you do not get to rewrite. I remember looking at him, this polished man standing in my driveway, threatening me in front of my sick wife, and feeling strangely calm. Because what Grant did not know was that I had already started pulling old drainage maps, permit records, and survey overlays from the county database. He thought I had built a wall. He did not realize he had just handed me a reason to start digging. The digging started in my garage, which was already half workshop, half museum of things I swore I might need someday. Old pipe wrenches, extension cords, coffee cans full of screws, and one perfectly good carburetor from a lawnmower I had not owned since 2006. I spread county drainage maps across 2 folding tables and taped aerial photos to a sheet of plywood. Then I started marking every culvert, every slope change, every fresh concrete patch, and every place water should have gone but did not. Marianne sat nearby most evenings, folding dish towels and watching old reruns with the volume low. And every now and then she would look over at me and say, You have that look again. I would say, What look? And she would smile a little and say, The look you had when the cable company overcharged us $9 for 6 straight months. That made me laugh, because she remembered that. Of all things, she remembered me spending 3 weeks proving a billing error like I was preparing for the Supreme Court. Those little moments with her were like finding coins in an old coat pocket. Small, ordinary, but enough to make the day feel less cruel. By Tuesday night, the pattern was too clear to ignore. Somebody had redirected runoff away from the North Ridge, Grant Ellery's Street, Dr. Ben, Vale's Creekside Lot, and the 3 largest homes in Ashford Lakes, then dumped that water into the older middle lots where people had smaller savings accounts and quieter voices. I found 14 drainage changes that did not match the original engineering plans, and when I searched the permit records, most of them simply did not exist. That is when I stopped feeling like a cranky old man with a grudge and started feeling like a witness. The HOA emergency meeting came 2 days later. Subject line in all caps. Community compliance and safety concerns. Mandatory attendance requested. Which in HOA language means we are about to embarrass someone in public and would appreciate applause. I almost did not take Marianne, but she insisted, said she wanted to see what all the fuss was about, and I could tell she was having one of her clear evenings, one of those rare little windows where she was fully herself and stubborn as a fence post. So I put on a clean shirt, packed my binder, and we drove to the clubhouse just after sunset. The place looked like a model home had swallowed a conference room. Beige walls, fake plants, framed photographs of ducks no one had ever seen in real life, coffee burning in the corner, and about 60 neighbors sitting in folding chairs with the nervous posture of people who know drama is coming but want to pretend they are above enjoying it. Grant stood at the front beside a projector screen, shaking hands like he was running for county commissioner, while Celeste moved through the room whispering into ears and touching shoulders, spreading concern the way other people spread butter. Dr. Vale sat near the board table in a navy sport coat, checking his phone, looking bored in the expensive way. When Grant saw me, his smile widened. There he is, he said loud enough for the room, our resident flood engineer. A few people laughed, and I felt Marianne's hand tighten around mine. I leaned toward her and said, Don't worry, sweetheart. He brought jokes because he is short on facts. She smiled, just barely. Grant opened with slides. Actual slides, close-up pictures of my limestone barrier from weird dramatic angles, like he had hired a crime scene photographer for a 2-foot wall. He talked about aesthetic disruption, runoff liability, community precedent, and structural inconsistency, all the phrases people use when they want greed to sound like governance. Celeste stood after him and said, We all bought into Ashford Lakes because it represented a certain standard, and when one homeowner decides to build something aggressive, it affects all of us. I raised my hand and said, Lestay, this, when water entered my kitchen at 2 in the morning. It affected me pretty good too. That got a couple of murmurs. That Grant cut in fast. Ray, you will have your opportunity. Dr. Varley took his turn. smooth and cold, saying property values could be damaged if residents were allowed to improvise flood defenses and that the board had a responsibility to preserve order. Preserve order. I remember that phrase because it sounded so clean, and nothing about what they had done was clean. Then Grant looked straight at me and said, "Mr. Cole, before the board votes on enforcement, would you like to explain why you believe the rules did not apply to you?" There it was. The whole performance. Not safety, not policy. Humiliation dressed up as procedure. I stood slowly, carried my binder to the front, and set it on the table. I said, "Sure, Grant. I can explain my wall. But first I have a few questions about yours." His face barely moved, but I saw the smile tighten. I opened the binder to the first tab and held up a county setback diagram. Question 1. Why does your rear pool expansion sit 9 feet inside a protected drainage easement? The room got quiet in a way you could feel in your teeth. Grant said, "That is unrelated." I said, "Maybe." Then turned the page. Question 2. Why does Dr. Vala's retaining wall block the original overflow channel behind Creek Bend Lane? Dr. Varlow sat forward, eyes sharp now. I turned another page. Question 3. Why are there 14 drainage modifications in this neighborhood over the last 4 years with no corresponding city permits, no public notice, and no environmental review? That is when the room changed. People stopped looking at me like I was the problem and started looking at the board table like something underneath it had begun to smell. Grant tried to interrupt, but I spread the maps out before he could regain control. Old grading plan on the left, current runoff routes on the right, aerial photographs in the middle, red lines showing the new channels, blue lines showing where the water used to go. You did not need to be an engineer to see it. The water had been bent around the expensive homes and sent downhill. Hank, the postal worker, stood up from the third row and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." A woman named Linda Mercer, whose basement had flooded twice in 1 year, started crying quietly and said, "My insurance dropped me after the second claim." Another man said, "The Parkers sold after their foundation cracked." Somebody else said, "Ellery Group bought that house, didn't they?" And just like that, one question became 10, then 20, and Grant's perfect little meeting began sliding out from under him. Celeste snapped. "These are accusations, not evidence." I looked at her and said, "No, Mom, these are county records. The accusations are free." That got one real laugh, and it was the first time all night Grant looked scared. Not guilty, not sorry, scared, because the room had stopped obeying him. He slapped the table and said, "This meeting is adjourned pending legal review." Nobody moved. That might have been my favorite part, honestly. For years, people had treated that man like the mayor of a town he invented, and suddenly he was just a nervous real estate broker in a blazer, asking for control and not getting it. Outside, the air smelled like rain, heavy and metallic. Dr. Vale caught me near my truck while Marianne waited by the passenger door. He said, "You should be careful, Raymond. Men with limited resources often mistake attention for power." I looked at him for a second, then said, "Preston, I spent half my career standing waist-deep in things richer men paid taxes to make disappear. You are going to have to do better than sounding disappointed." His jaw flexed. "You do not understand what you are disrupting." I said, "No, Doc. I think I am finally understanding exactly what I am disrupting." The next morning, Grant tried the official route. A city inspector showed up at my house around 10, a tired man named Miguel Alvarez with a clipboard, steel toe boots, and the expression of somebody who had already heard 3 lies before breakfast. Grant arrived right behind him, pretending it was a coincidence, wearing sunglasses though the sky was overcast. Miguel said there had been a complaint about an illegal structure, unpermitted electrical work, and improper drainage discharge. I said, "Come on in. I keep my paperwork better than I keep my sock drawer." He inspected the barrier for nearly an hour, checked the footing, the drainage trench, the low-voltage lighting, the outlet path, the county approval, the stamped engineering note, and the final inspection form. Grant stood there the whole time with his arms folded, waiting for the universe to love him again. Finally, Miguel closed his folder and said, "Mr. Cole, this is one of the cleaner residential flood mitigation builds I have seen. Everything checks out. I swear, if Grant had bitten his tongue any harder, he would have needed Dr. Vale to sew it back on." Then I said, "Miguel, since you are here, "Would you mind looking at something behind Fairmont Court?" Grant said. "That is common area, Ray." I said, "Perfect. Then it belongs to all of us." We walked down the service path behind the decorative creek. Anna showed Miguel the fresh concrete, the hidden bypass cuts, the altered slope, the buried diverter pipe tucked behind the ornamental boulders. All the little details nobody noticed because they've been made pretty. Miguel crouched by one culvert and ran his thumb along the edge of the concrete. "This is recent," he said quietly. Grant jumped in. "That infrastructure has existed for years." Miguel looked up at him and said, "Not this section. Concrete tells time, Mr. Ellery." That shut him up. Then Miguel stood and said the sentence that changed the temperature of the whole morning. "Unauthorized alteration of municipal drainage can trigger county enforcement, state environmental review, and possibly federal wetland involvement, depending on where this water is being diverted." Grant went pale behind his sunglasses. I could not see his eyes, but I could see his mouth go slack. After Miguel left, Grant stayed in my driveway. No smile this time. No jokes about sieges. Just a man trying to decide how much truth he could buy before it became too expensive. "Ray," he said, "maybe we all got off on the wrong foot." I said, "Funny. I thought you were standing on my throat pretty squarely." He took a breath. "The board may be willing to withdraw the enforcement action if you agree to stop spreading inflammatory claims. And the drainage, that is complicated." "No, Grant. It is wet or it is dry, you fill or downhill. Permitted or not permitted, those are not complicated ideas." His voice dropped. "You have no idea what flood exposure would do to the North Ridge valuations." There it was, not community, not safety, not harmony. Valuations. He knew he had said too much the second it left his mouth. I looked at him and said, "You could have fixed this before anyone got hurt." He stared back at me and said, "People panic when they hear flood risk." I said, "Greedy people panic when they hear accountability." That weekend, the legal papers came. A temporary restraining order request, a demand letter, claims that my barrier created risk to neighboring properties and emotional distress to the community. Emotional distress. My wife had stood barefoot in muddy kitchen water asking for her dead father, and Grant Ellery wanted damages for hurt feelings. I was reading the papers at the kitchen table when Marianne asked if we were in trouble. I looked at her, at the little tremble in her fingers, and I said, "Not yet, honey, but we are getting interesting." That Sunday evening, right before dinner, the doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a small woman in a yellow raincoat, white hair tucked under a hood, holding 2 banker boxes like they weighed nothing. Her name was Ruth Ann Pritchard, retired county records clerk, widow, lived 3 streets over. The kind of woman everybody underestimated because she brought lemon bars to meetings and remembered birthdays. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mr. Cole, I believe our HOA has been running a flood damage scheme." I stepped aside without saying a word. She put the boxes on my dining table, opened the first one, and began laying out property transfers, insurance notices, foreclosure filings, contractor invoices, and resale documents with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 30 years making bureaucrats regret sloppy paperwork. While I had been following the water, Ruth Ann had been following the money. According to her records, companies tied to Grant Ellery had purchased 18 flood-damaged homes in Ashford Lakes over 4 years, almost all in the lower and middle sections, almost all after drainage changes increased runoff exposure, then renovated them through friendly contractors and sold them at a profit once the damage history got buried under fresh paint and new cabinets. My stomach went cold. This was not just rich people protecting their own houses. This was a business model. Ruth Ann slid one invoice across the table, and I still remember the title printed at the top: Private Watershed Correction and Asset Protection Routing. No permit number. No city approval. Signed by an Ellery Group project manager and billed through a landscaping subcontractor. Marianne stood in the doorway behind us, quiet, holding her cardigan closed, and for a moment I felt ashamed that all this ugliness had followed her into the one place I was trying to make safe. Ruth Ann must have seen it on my face because she said softly, "Men like Grant count on decent people getting tired." I looked down at the invoice, then at the map still taped in my garage, then toward the window where clouds were gathering again over Ashford Lakes. And I knew the next storm was going to decide more than whose carpet got wet. The storm came in on the Tuesday evening, which felt unfair somehow. Like if your whole neighborhood is going to fall apart, the weather ought to at least have the decency to do it on a Friday. The sky turned that strange greenish gray you only see in Texas when the air gets heavy and the birds go quiet, and by 5 o'clock, the rain was already coming down in thick sideways sheets, slapping against windows, filling gutters, turning every streetlight into a blurry yellow halo. Grant, being Grant, had decided not to cancel the HOA town hall that night, because apparently denial works best when served with coffee and folding chairs. The email said the board wanted to restore trust, clarify misinformation, and promote unity, which meant they planned to stand in front of the neighborhood and call me crazy with better lighting. Marianne did not want to go at first. She was tired, and the sound of hard rain made her nervous after the kitchen flood. But then she saw me putting Ruth Ann's folders into a plastic storage bin, and she said, real quiet, "Are you going to make them stop?" I told her I was going to try. She nodded like that was good enough, then put on her blue sweater, the one our daughter Megan gave her for Christmas, and said, "Then I'm coming too." I drove slow to the clubhouse because the streets were already running with water, but my section looked different this time. Not dry exactly, but controlled. The runoff moved along the restored curb channels and around my barrier just the way it was supposed to. No creeping under doors. No brown water clawing across tile. No panic in my wife's eyes. Up on the North Ridge, though, you could see headlights moving too fast, garage doors opening, men in golf shirts standing in the rain and pointing at drains like pointing his ever-stocked washer in the history of mankind. The clubhouse was packed when we arrived. Everybody wanted answers now. Not gossip, not rumors, answers. Grant stood at the front in a charcoal jacket, his hair damp but still arranged like it had a legal team. Celeste sat beside him with her arms crossed and her mouth pulled tight. And Dr. Sakame, Vale looked like a man trying to calculate whether arrogance was still a viable strategy. Grant tapped the microphone and said, "Folks, I know emotions are high, but tonight we need to separate facts from fear." I almost admired him. The man had more nerve than a raccoon in a dog food factory. He started talking about unauthorized speculation, the danger of community division, the importance of respecting proper legal channels, and while he spoke, thunder rolled over the roof so hard the coffee cups rattled on the back table. Then he said my name. He said certain residents had taken it upon themselves to create panic for personal leverage, and that was when Marianne, sweet Marianne, who sometimes forgot what day it was, leaned toward me and whispered, "He lies nicely." I nearly laughed out loud. Instead, I stood up. Grant paused, annoyed. I carried the storage bin to the front, set it on the table, and said, "You want facts, Grant. Let's give them facts." I pulled out Ruth Ann's property transfer records first, then the drainage overlays, then the contractor invoices, then the resale documents, one stack after another, until the table looked less like a town hall and more like a prosecutor's office with bad carpet. Ruth Ann stood behind me, small as a bird and twice as sharp, and began reading dates, addresses, purchase prices, flood claims, and resale profits in a voice so calm it made the whole thing uglier. 18 homes bought through companies tied to Ellery Group, all after repeated water damage, all in the lower sections, all flipped after repairs, and all while unpermitted drainage work protected the North Ridge from the very flooding everyone else was told to accept as bad luck. Linda Mercer stood up and said, "You bought my neighbor's house for half of what it was worth after her foundation failed." Hank said, "My boy helped tear out drywall on Aspen Court. Same contractor name is right there." The room started turning, not loud at first, just murmurs and disbelief. But then disbelief has a way of becoming anger once people realize they were not unlucky. They were useful. Celeste snapped that none of us understood real estate development, and Ruth Ann looked at her over the top of her glasses and said, "Honey, I understand signatures. That line should have gotten applause. Maybe it did. I cannot remember. Because right then every phone in the room screamed at once. Flash flood warning. Seek higher ground immediately." The lights flickered. The emergency exit signs glowed red, and for one strange second, nobody moved. Then Grant's phone rang. He looked at the screen, frowned, answered, and I watched the color drain out of his face. "What do you mean the lower level is taking water?" he said. Then louder, "What do you mean both garage doors failed?" Dr. Vale's phone rang next, then Celeste's. Then 2 other Northridge homeowners started shouting into theirs. Somebody ran to the windows. Outside, water was pouring down Ridgeview Drive like a river that had been waiting years to remember its name. The illegal diversions had been shut down under emergency county supervision earlier that afternoon after Miguel escalated the report, and once the system stopped cheating, the water did what water does. It went where gravity had always meant for it to go. I want to be clear about that because people still argue about it online. I did not break a pump. I did not cut a wire. I did not sneak around in the rain like some 71-year-old Batman with arthritis. I handed over records. Miguel brought county authority, and the unauthorized controls were taken offline because they were illegal and dangerous. The storm handled the rest. Grant shoved past 2 neighbors and bolted for the door. Celeste followed in heels that were not built for justice or weather. Half the room went after them. Not to help exactly. More like people follow smoke. I held Marianne's hand and walked outside beneath the clubhouse awning, and there it was, the North Ridge drowning in its own secret. Water surged over Grant's imported stone driveway, slammed into the side gates, rolled through the front entry of his big glass house, and poured across those polished floors he loved showing off at Christmas parties. He stood knee-deep in muddy water, screaming into his phone, "Save the media room first. Save the media room." And I remember thinking, there is a sentence only a certain kind of man gets to yell during a flood. Doctor. Vale was across the street dragging wet leather chairs toward his porch while rain soaked his designer shirt flat against his back. Celeste stood beside her SUV crying, not the broken kind of crying, more the furious kind. Like she could not believe nature had failed to recognize her status. And down the hill, my little limestone barrier held, quiet as a hymn, with yellow lantanas bending in the rain. A local news van arrived 20 minutes later because Ruth Ann, as it turned out, had a nephew who worked weekends at Channel 6 and a deep belief in documentation. The reporter stepped into the rain with her hood up, camera light blowing, and Grant saw them before he saw me. That was when he lost the last piece of himself he had been pretending was dignity. He pointed at me and shouted, "This man did this. He flooded my home." The camera swung toward me. I could feel every neighbor watching, every raindrop running down my face. Marianne's fingers tucked into mine. I said, "No, Grant. You flooded your own home the day you decided other families were cheaper to sacrifice than your property value." He yelled, "You ruined me." I said, "No. I just stopped helping you hide." That clip went everywhere by morning. Within a week, county engineers were on site, then state environmental investigators, then federal people once the wetland impact questions surfaced. Ellery Group's files did not hold up well under daylight. They were altered flood maps, buried disclosures, payments routed through landscaping vendors, pressure placed on contractors, and enough ugly emails to make even Grant's lawyer look tired. The HOA board collapsed before summer. Grant resigned and disappeared behind attorneys. Dr. Vale settled quietly and sold his house at a loss, which I know is not a tragedy, but I enjoyed the symmetry. Celeste deleted her public accounts, and Ashford Lakes, that perfect little postcard of a neighborhood, had to learn how to be a real community for once. Messy meetings, angry questions, repair funds, drainage restoration, people apologizing badly and forgiving slowly. Some folks treated me like a hero. Others said I went too public, that I should have let the courts handle it quietly. That humiliating Grant in the middle of a storm made me no better than him. Maybe they have a point. I have asked myself that more than once. But then I remember Marianne standing barefoot in muddy water, asking for her father. And I remember Grant laughing at the wall I built to keep her safe. And I have a hard time feeling sorry for a man whose only real punishment was being forced to live for one night with the consequences he had been sending downhill for years. A month after it all ended, Marianne and I sat outside after a light rain, watching clean water move through the restored channels under a sunset that turned the limestone warm gold. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "You fixed the river." I told her it was not a river, just runoff. She patted my hand and said, "You always correct the wrong part." Then she looked at the wall, at the flowers, at the street that no longer smelled like mud, and said, "You fix the mean people too." I did not answer right away, because when someone you love is slowly leaving you, and they hand you one clear sentence like that, you do not waste it by talking over it. You just sit there and let it stay. So now I will ask what people still ask me. Was I right to drag the whole thing into the open, knowing it would ruin reputations, wreck careers, and split the neighborhood down the middle? Or should I have stayed quiet and trusted the same system that had ignored the damage for years? If your community leaders were secretly protecting wealthy homeowners by pushing disaster onto everyone else, would you expose them publicly, no matter how ugly it got? Or would you say there is a line decent people should not cross, even when the powerful crossed it first? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I have heard both sides, and I'm still not sure the clean answer exists. And if this story made you think about who really pays the price when powerful people protect appearances, hit subscribe and share it with someone who has ever lived under a neighborhood rule made by people who never planned to suffer from it.